39-year-old Chuck Morgan was a successful businessman. He was the president of his own escrow agency. He also was a potential witness in a state land fraud case involving a known crime boss. On March 22, 1977, he left his Tucson, Arizona home to drive two of his daughters to school. After dropping them off, he simply vanished. 3 days later, he arrived back at home. According to his wife, Ruth, he was missing a shoe, had a plastic handcuff around one ankle, and both hands tied with zip ties. He couldn't speak, but with a pen and paper, he wrote down that he had been kidnapped and tortured. He also wrote that a hallucinogenic drug had been painted on his throat. He claimed that this drug would drive him insane or kill him if he ingested it. He asked Ruth to move his car because he did not want them to know he had returned home. However, he would not say who they were. He also told her not to call the police because a hit would be put out on their lives. For 1 week, Ruth nursed Chuck back to health by feeding him with an eyedropper. Before his voice returned, he began to allude to a secret identity. He claimed he had worked as an agent for the federal government and had fought against organized crime. He also claimed that they had taken his treasury identification. He said that he escaped from his captors near Phoenix's Sky Harbor Airport. After his kidnapping, Chuck became justifiably paranoid. He began wearing a bulletproof vest and even grew a beard to further mask his identity. He also started driving his daughters to and from school. He informed the school that no one else should be allowed to pick the daughters up except for himself. On June 7th, 2 months after his initial disappearance, Chuck vanished again. Shortly before his second disappearance, he had told his father that if anything were to happen to him, there was a letter he had written that would tell them who was responsible. This letter has never been found. However, 9 days later, an unidentified woman called Ruth and said, "Chuck is all right." Ecclesiastes 12, verses 1 through 8. This is a reference to a Bible passage which reads in part, "Men are afraid of a high place, and of terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is broken, and the golden bowl is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth, as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." 2 days later, Chuck was found shot to death. Despite the fact he was wearing a bulletproof vest, his body was found in the desert 30 feet off the highway in the San Juan Springs area. He'd been shot once in the back of the head with a bullet from his very own .357 Magnum, which was found laying beside him. No fingerprints were found on it. Gunshot residue was found on his left hand, indicating he had fired the weapon, or a weapon. In his car, police found a note that had directions to the crime scene, written in his own handwriting. Also found in the car were several weapons, ammunition, and a CB radio. Strangely, a piece of one of his teeth was found wrapped in a white handkerchief in the back seat. A pair of sunglasses was also found. They didn't belong to him. Chuck had clipped a $2 bill inside his underwear. Written on that bill were 7 Spanish names from the letters A to G. Also, Ecclesiastes 12 was written, with the verses 1 through 8 marked by arrows drawn on the back of the bill's serial number. This was the same reference that the female caller had made to Ruth. On the back of the bill, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were numbered 1 through 7. Also, a crude map was drawn, which showed several roads between Tucson and the Mexican border. A few towns were also marked. These towns appeared to be at that time known for drug smuggling. 2 days after Chuck's death, an anonymous woman spoke to an officer for the Pima County Sheriff's Department on the telephone. She claimed she was supposed to meet Chuck at a local motel shortly before he died. She also claimed that her nickname was Green Eyes and that she was the same woman that had called Ruth several days earlier. She also claimed that at that motel, Chuck showed her a briefcase containing several thousands of dollars in cash. He said that money would buy him out of a gang contract that had been put on his life. Surprisingly, despite the bizarre evidence, authorities ruled that Chuck committed suicide. They believed he did so either because of financial difficulties or fears for his safety. Chuck's family and a reporter named Don Devereaux believe he was indeed murdered. Also, some other investigators suspect that his death wasn't a suicide. Shortly after Chuck's death, his impounded car was broken into while it was in police possession. Around the same time, his office was also ransacked. 3 weeks after his death, 2 men claiming to be FBI agents arrived at the Morgan home. They told Ruth they had to look through the entire house, and they tore the house apart. It's unknown if they ever found anything or if they were even FBI agents. When the reporter Devereaux contacted the FBI, they claimed they'd never even heard of Chuck Morgan. There are several rumors surrounding this case, including that Chuck was killed because he was involved with illegal activity or was doing secret work for the government. His death seems just as unexplained as the events leading to it. Although Chuck claimed he was working against organized crime, some believe that he was actually involved with it. During the 1970s, Tucson, along with other cities in Arizona, became a place the mafia began to move to. Due to a warmer climate and a controversial criminal justice system, the move was led by former New York Don Joseph Bonanno. More than 500 racketeers moved to Tucson during the 1970s. Their influence led to several gangland-style killings in the area. One of the more famous killings being the murder of investigative reporter Don Bowles. What made Arizona most attractive to the crime syndicates was a unique state law that allowed them to buy land through numbered blind trusts. This would allow them to remain completely anonymous and successfully launder money. It is known Chuck did real estate escrow work for at least one mafia family. They may have used him to do escrow work for purchases of gold bullion and platinum. This was a more convenient way for them to launder money. Starting in 1973, it appeared that Chuck was doing several millions of dollars worth of escrow work in bullion and platinum. But in reality, there wasn't any bullion or platinum. Instead, the money was moved through several escrow accounts and legitimized. On one occasion, Chuck mentioned to Ruth that money laundering was occurring in Tucson. However, he claimed he was never involved in it. He also stated that the less she and the children knew about his activities, the better it would be for them. It is theorized that Chuck Morgan was killed by members of organized crime in the Tucson area. It is possible that the mafia family that he worked for had him killed because he indeed knew too much. One theory is that organized crime bosses put the word out that they wanted Chuck Morgan dead. The hitman then told Chuck, so he came up with the money in order to buy the hitman off. However, when the two met in the desert, the hitman killed him anyway and took the money. Now, this theory has never been confirmed. On a February 7th, 1990 episode of Unsolved Mysteries, Chuck's case was featured. After the episode aired, several calls came in related to Chuck's death. Don Devereaux investigated several of these leads. As a result, he did learn that Chuck was heavily involved in money laundering activities. From 1973 to 1977, at the time of his death, he had also been involved in large gold and platinum transactions. He apparently received a large amount of money from these activities. Some of this money allegedly came from Southeast Asia. Devereaux discovered that Chuck kept duplicate records of his illicit transactions. Devereaux now believes that Chuck was killed because he still had these records. 3 months after the initial broadcast, Doug Johnston was found shot to death in his car outside of his Phoenix office. Interestingly, he worked across the street from Devereaux's office and drove an almost identical car. Devereaux now believes he was supposed to be killed instead of Doug. A year after Doug's murder, Devereaux was contracted by a writer from D.C. named Danny Corso. He agreed to share with him the information he had uncovered about Chuck's illegal gold transactions. However, Danny too died suspiciously before he received the information. All 3 cases remain unsolved. Sadly, Chuck's widow, Ruth Morgan, passed away in 2006.
You said you were going to ask me questions.
And that's when you get to say hello. This is for being shit, All right.
Hello.
Welcome to the Fucker's Grade Lemonade Podcast.